Have you ever stood face to face with a man who, in another world, could have ruled an empire? Much. I have. And it happened in the ruins of a defeated Germany, with the smell of smoke and war still hanging in the air. I was just a private first class, 19 years old, Jewish, and barely old enough to shave. Across from me stood a 2-star general of the Waffen-SS, his uniform crisp, his boots polished, his chin held high in military precision. The irony struck me like a physical blow. Me, the boy who had fled Nazi Germany as a child, now interrogating one of its most powerful men. When he stated his name, my blood ran cold. My years of German schooling made the recognition instant. He wasn't just any officer. He was the son of the Kaiser. The man who, under different circumstances, might have been Emperor of Germany. In that moment, the war, the years of hatred, exile, and loss, compressed into a single breath. I wasn't looking at an abstract enemy anymore. I was looking at the living embodiment of the world my family had escaped. Now, Kurot, I stopped the interrogation, went straight to my captain, and said the words that would ripple through our entire unit. Thavens, sir, we've got a big one. I was born in Breslau, Germany, a city that doesn't even exist by that name anymore. After the war, it became part of Poland, renamed Wrocław. But when I was a boy, it was my home. And it was where I learned, long before most children understand the world, that some people wanted me dead simply because I was Jewish. It began with whispers I overheard from the adults. My uncle had been attacked by Nazi stormtroopers. When they realized he was Jewish, they killed him. Not in some hidden place, but in the open, without shame, without consequence. The stormtroopers came for our livelihood next. They marched in front of my father's sporting goods store, holding signs declaring, "Don't buy from Jews." Sevens. He saw the writing on the wall, sold the store, and from then on, our lives slid downward, financially and socially. My mother, ever the quiet strategist, began making plans in secret. When we left Germany, we carried 1 suitcase each and 10 marks, barely enough to buy a meal. But she had already booked us passage on the Holland-America line, first class, and reserved 2 weeks in a New York hotel. We slipped out of our apartment at 5 in the morning, said goodbye to family we would never see again, and boarded a train for Berlin. We arrived in the United States on October 30th, 1938. 10 days later came Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, when synagogues burned, Jewish-owned businesses were destroyed, and thousands of Jewish men were arrested. By sheer luck and my mother's foresight, we had escaped just in time. I didn't know it then, but that journey was just the beginning. The war would follow me. And in time, I would return to Europe, not as a refugee, but as a soldier in the United States Army. By April 1945, the war in Europe was drawing to a close, but in our sector, the fighting still had sharp edges. Our orders came down, pushed toward the Elbe River. The Germans were collapsing, their lines fragmenting. In the small towns we passed through, we saw them, soldiers in tattered uniforms, hands up, desperate to surrender. They weren't afraid of us. They were afraid of what lay to the east. The closer we got to the Elbe, the more obvious it became. No one wanted to fall into Russian hands. Stories had spread through the ranks, stories of how the Russians treated their prisoners after what the Germans had done on the Eastern Front. It was enough to make hardened Waffen-SS veterans scramble to wave white flags at the sight of an American Jeep. When we reached the riverbank at Magdeburg, The orders came for my captain to cross and meet with the Russians. There was a very specific message to deliver. Sevens. They were to stay on their side of the river until we withdrew in a few months, even though the territory west of the Elbe would eventually be in their occupation zone. It was the kind of handshake agreement between powers that could keep armies from colliding. The captain needed someone to go with him. He couldn't find a Russian speaker anywhere. Finally, he turned to me. "Khan, you're coming." Sevens. I protested. "Sir, I only know one word in Russian. Tovarish, friend." Sevens. He didn't care. "Carry the map," he said. We found a German boatman and started across. Halfway over, the captain stood up so the Russians could see the American uniform. Their reaction when we landed was overwhelming. They hugged us, kissed us, lifted us off our feet. Vodka bottles appeared from nowhere. Cigarettes traded hands. I was 19, had never tasted vodka before. One sip told me to tread carefully. While the captain was taken to the rear to find a proper interpreter, I stayed on the riverbank with a Russian NCO who took a liking to me. Our conversation was a comedy of single words and gestures. He pointed to himself, Moscow. Sevens. I pointed to myself, New York. Sevens. He grinned and said, "You come Moscow." Sevens. I laughed. "You come New York." Sevens. We both knew it would never happen, but it felt like a friendship in miniature. Eventually, the captain returned, smiling. The meeting had gone well. We pushed off back toward the American side, waving until the current carried us out of sight. It wasn't until weeks later, lying in my cot one night, that the full meaning of that moment hit me. The Russians hadn't just been welcoming us as allies. They were celebrating survival. Every German who had faced them had fought bitterly, knowing that capture meant a brutal fate. For those Russian soldiers on the Elbe, seeing an American uniform meant the war was over for them, and they had lived to see it. By January 1945, the snow in Belgium had turned gray with soot and blood. The Battle of the Bulge was winding down, but the tension in the air never eased. Our orders kept us moving, city to city, always behind the infantry's advance, hunting for high-value targets on two lists, building objectives that could aid the U.S. occupation and personality targets, war criminals, political leaders, and officers wanted for interrogation. Cologne was our first major city. By the time we got there, most Nazi officials had already fled across the Rhine. The skyline was a forest of ruins, church spires jutting out like broken teeth. We found nothing but empty offices and abandoned files. From there, we crossed the Rhine at Remagen, over the famous Ludendorff Bridge, and pushed into Düsseldorf. Here, we finally began to round up suspects, men whose names matched our lists. They were brought in for preliminary questioning, to confirm identities before being sent off for deeper interrogation and eventual trial. The work required patience and precision. I was a private first class, but with fluent German, I sat across from high-ranking officers, staring into the eyes of men who had built the war machine that had driven me and my family from our home. Some answered questions coldly, others tried to charm their way out, but all knew that if they ended up in Russian hands, their fate would be far worse. That fear became a quiet weapon for us. Frankfurt brought the most intense days yet. We arrived with the city still smoldering, streets littered with rubble and the smell of cordite hanging in the air. There, in a makeshift interrogation room, I stood face to face with a man who came to rigid attention the moment I addressed him. He was tall, lean, his uniform immaculate despite the chaos outside. "Name?" I asked. "Aust Wilhelm von Hohenzollern," he replied. The syllables hit me like a jolt of electricity. My German schooling had etched that name into my mind. This was no ordinary prisoner. This was the son of the Kaiser. A Waffen-SS two-star general, heir to a throne that no longer existed, sitting across from a Jewish PFC who had fled Nazi Germany as a child. For a moment, the irony almost overwhelmed me. I could still see the stormtroopers outside my family's store in Breslau, chanting that Jews were a disaster, urging people not to buy from us. Now, here was a man born into the same ruling class that had helped set those events in motion, standing at attention in front of me. I stopped the interrogation immediately and went to my captain. "Sir, we've got a big one," I told him. When he asked who, I said, "The son of the Kaiser." They took him away within minutes. I never saw him again. But that moment, that surreal collision of past and present, made me realize the strange twists of war. We were still pushing deeper into Germany, but now I understood. Every mile forward was bringing me closer to faces from history. And perhaps ghosts from my own past. April 1945. The war was breathing its last, but the guns had not yet fallen silent. Our T-Force team was driving east, chasing the final objectives. The map showed our next destination, Magdeburg, sitting on the Elbe River. The other side belonged to the Russians. We'd been warned. Do not cross. The Elbe was the agreed line. Still, orders came down to send an American officer across to speak with the Soviet command. My captain searched for a Russian linguist. None could be found. Finally, he turned to me. "Come with me, Kohn." "Captain," I protested. "I know one word in Russian, Tovarish, friend." Zevens. He didn't care. "Carry the map." We commandeered a German boatman, the river's cold mist curling around us as we rowed toward the far bank. Halfway across, the captain stood tall in the boat, making sure the Soviets could see the American uniform. When we reached shore, the reception was explosive. "Menangston," they rushed us, laughing, shouting, hugging. Rough hands clapped my back. A Russian NCO planted a kiss on my cheek. Bottles of vodka appeared, and I, at 19, took my first burning swallow before realizing one was enough. I traded cigarettes with them, miming conversations, me saying New York, them saying Moscow, each inviting the other across oceans we'd never cross. The captain was whisked away to the rear to meet their officers, leaving me on the riverbank with my new Soviet friend. Sevens. He had no idea I understood almost nothing he said, but the warmth in his eyes said enough. When the captain returned, he was smiling. The meeting had gone well. The Soviets agreed to stay put until the Americans withdrew from the area. We rowed back across the Elbe, the laughter and cheers still echoing from the far bank. It wasn't until weeks later that the truth hit me like a sudden chill. That joy, that celebration, wasn't about meeting Americans. It was relief, pure, desperate relief. For years, the Germans had fought the Russians with savage determination, knowing exactly what capture by the Red Army meant. They had seen villages burned, civilians slaughtered, prisoners executed. They feared Soviet vengeance more than death itself. So when those soldiers on the Elbe saw an American uniform coming toward them, they knew. They had survived. They would live to see another day. The war was ending, but in that moment on the riverbank, I understood something deeper. sevens. Survival wasn't just about outlasting the battle. It was about which hands you fell into when the shooting stopped. Aina. I've lived almost a century since that day on the Elbe, yet the faces remain as clear as the cold river water. The relief in the Russians' eyes, the quiet gratitude in the Germans. The war had been a storm that drowned millions, and somehow I had made it to the shore. The WWII. I came to America as a boy fleeing the Nazis, not knowing if my family's future would even exist. I put on the uniform of my new country, fought its war, and found myself standing eye to eye with the son of the Kaiser, interrogating generals whose armies had once sworn to erase people like me. The irony was never lost on me. But what stayed with me most was not the rank, the medals, or even the close brushes with death. It was the knowledge of what happens when hate is allowed to grow unchecked. I had seen it in the streets of Germany as a child. I had seen where it led in the camps, the ruins, the bodies. That is why I tell my story, not for glory, but as a warning. Hate turns ordinary people into executioners. It makes cruelty seem normal. It can happen anywhere, if we let it. The Elbe was a dividing line between armies. But for me, it will always be the place where I realized the most important battle is the one against hate itself.